the floods not only brought the water from India, but the dead bodies of the tortured Sikh youth. Nobody was there to cremate them. I have never seen such an atrocity against humanity, which I have seen in my life. And I'll never forget that, and that stays with me. That's the trauma of my life. Hence, despite being a Muslim who was born on the other side of the border, I have this passion to work, to advocate, and talk about systems. So this narrative should change that it was 1984. It started in 1984. This was a long, decade-long genocide, which still continues in the shape of transnational repression and the assassination of those who advocate for the Sikh rights. I will go to my presentation. So I will try to map what is genocide and how, by looking at the UN conference, we map the Sikh genocide. So genocide, as many of you would know, was coined by Raphael in the days of Holocaust, which is from two words, genocide and side, race and killing. Killing of a race is called genocide. Now, I have tried to tell people Sikhs are not only a religion, but they are race too, because most of you come from Punjab, so you share the race as well. Now, when we look at the UN Conventions about the genocide and prevention of it, the Article 2 of the UN Convention clarifies what is a genocide. So it says genocide is any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, or racial or religious group as such by killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harms, inflicting on group conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within that group, or forcibly transforming children of a group to another group. Now, looking at this definition of genocide, this is the textbook definition of the Sikh genocide. Many people have been misphrasing it. People have been saying this was rioting. Somebody was saying this was violence against it. Even my first presentation, which I really applaud, was a wonderful effort, says anti-Sikh violence. When you look at international context and in the context of genocide, every word has different meaning. Every word you associate with this has different implications when it comes to foreign policy or holding people accountable. In the international structures, we have atrocity crimes, we have crimes against humanity, and we have genocide. But looking at this convention's very simple definition of genocide, it was indeed genocide. And every Sikh in the world should refer it as genocide, not as program, not as anti-Sikh revolting or anti-Sikh program. Now, sometimes people attribute this to the killing of Indira Gandhi. For the young people also, and everyone sitting in the hall, please note, anything which happens all of a sudden due to an event could be anything but not a genocide. If what happened with the Sikh was just something related to death of a prime minister of a country, then it's not genocide. It's just what the party opposite is saying. Because when we're going to talk to these parliamentarians, when we're going to take it to the UN, they're going to ask you, if it was genocide as a result of a death of a person, then it wasn't a genocide, because genocide has different stages. And the genocide will have to be planned well in advance. So my next slide is actually on these 8 stages of genocide as we study in the genocidal studies. So what are these stages? These are classification, symbolization, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, extermination, and denial. So these 8 stages are what constitute a genocide. So whenever you talk about it, take this stance out that if Indra wasn't dead, Sikh genocide was well planned, and we all know that. And mapping these, first thing is classification. us against them, and distinguish by nationality, ethnicity, race, or religion. So, older generation will know when it comes to classification. Can anybody tell me what India classified Sikhs as after 1947? They, no, a tribe of criminals. A notification was issued soon after transfer of power in India in 1947, which says the Sikhs should be classified as tribe of criminals. So when we come to the first stage of classification to commit genocide, India classified you as tribe of criminals by putting you against the rest of the India and rest of the nations living in state of Union. Then it comes to civilization about names, languages, titles, uniform, icon, and everything else. So the older generation would know when it was issue of language. One language, one state was created, but Punjabi Suba wasn't created because language were created. And then it's organization. When one group denies the unity of another group, hate propaganda, dehumanization process. So all that what Indian media did at the commencement of this genocide, after or during those 10 years, by writing about the Sikhs that they are separatists, they are terrorists, they want a Sikh state, they are anti-national. This is all what was denying the humanity of another group. The Anandpur Sahib resolution was all about the constitutional right of the Sikhs, but it was represented to the rest of the Indian population that Sikhs are separatists. Sikhs want a separate state. It wasn't the case. Even Sanjhe, who is our national hero, he never said that he wanted a Pakistan straight away. He said the day the Indian army put its footstep in the Balsa, on that day, the foundation of Pakistan would be set. Another thing also need to understand that genocide is not an individual's act. It is a group crime. So there are other crimes and there are group crimes. So genocide has to be a group crime. So looking at this definition of group crime, the way the mobs attacked the Sikhs, the way the Hindu mobs used the transport, the way the Hindu mobs had access to the lists and everything else for the Sikhs. So that was a group crime. It wasn't an individual's crime. Hence this stage of organization is there. I hope I'm not boring you. This is not usually how I speak in my presentations. This is a very technical stuff. But for you to digest this technical stuff is very important, especially for the younger generation, because when you're going to speak to other people and going to call it genocide, you should have a context. And if you don't have a context and you appear before a UN or a parliament and you don't know what you're talking about, people are not going to buy into our emotional narrative. People are not going to buy into what we usually say, that's not what buys into. So, sorry if it is a bit boring, my presentation today, but you need to understand all of this. And again, then the polarization, preparation, and extermination. I will skip these three parts because the young lady before me has very well elaborated it. Now, we go to the next stage, which is denial. So, Government of India, as we know, has been denying it, and everybody who commit atrocity crimes always deny it. First, they deny the evidence. We have clearly seen that Government of India and all its agents, this genocide was being committed, especially the attack on the Basa in 1984. The state of Punjab was completely blocked. No journalists were allowed. No one was allowed to gather the evidence, and that was all because they want to deny the evidence. Even the way the people were not cremated, and one of the examples I have given, that a lot of Sikh youth who was extrajudicially killed was dumped into the water, in the rivers and in the canals, and was not cremated. So that was to really deny from the evidence. And as you all know, Sardar This one thing, Vichar, he discovered those mass cremation sites. He talked about those disappeared dead bodies, and then he disappeared. But, my dear young fellows, after Sardar Khala disappeared, no other Sikh has disappeared. So we should remember those Sikhs who have given their life to collect and gather that evidence. And then obviously attack on the truth tellers, that is also part of denial of genocide. This is what Government of India is consistently doing. It is attacking all truth tellers, including myself. And what we have recently seen, transnational repression, where you have Vichar being martyred in Canada, Paramveer Singh were martyred in Lahore, and threats to other people who talk about the truth. So all that is attacking them. And then, one thing which you need to note, the perpetrator of violence will always like to forget it. They will say, oh, it was 40 years ago. Let's forget, let's move on, let's reconcile. Reconciliation without justice is nothing. You can only reconcile if justice is served. And one of the problems with the perpetrator of violence is that they try to convince you, this matter was 40 years ago, just forget about it, let's move on. But for the Sikhs, it's not a matter to move on, because it's not only the Sikh genocide which happened on this earth, someone else's genocide happened as well. And you know what they have adopted? Never again. So Sikhs have to fight for the justice. Sikhs have to take this approach that we will hold the perpetrator of violence to accountability. Now, again I had some graphics which might be very, very challenging for some of you, so discretion of the audience is requested. So this is how the Sikh genocide looks like. This is how people were burned alive. This is how the dead body was scattered. And that's a Galta site in June 1984. And you can see in the current site. Women were raped, people were burned alive. And you know, when we talk about the Wild West, and when we talk about Australia, you know what they used to do when they were committing the genocide of the local natives here? They used to take the skull. Same thing happened in 1984 at the streets of Delhi. They were scalped. Their hairs were taken, and their sanctity was compromised. Now, there is a recognition of the Sikh genocide as well. So this is the part for the members of this house to consider. So, for the last 10 years, in collaboration with the United Sikh Caucus, we have been working with the state assemblies and the US Congress to get the Sikh genocide recognized. So this is one of the resolutions text, because now we have state of California, state of Texas, state of Pennsylvania. They have passed the resolutions to recognize the Sikh genocide. And I'm very delighted to share that 2 weeks ago, Congressman David Varadero, who is a friend of mine, and Congressman Jim Costa, whom I worked over the years, they have introduced a resolution at the US House of Representatives, which is US Congress, to recognize the Sikh genocide. It was a long, tiring journey of 10 years, and it matters a lot that at the 40th commemoration of the Sikh genocide, that has been introduced in the US Parliament. May I request all of you, Australian Sikhs, that you should contact your member parliament, your senators, your members, and ask them, we want a similar resolution to come in the Australian Parliament to recognize the Sikh genocide. This is the first stage towards our right to self-determination. And this genocide, as I said, hasn't stopped. Now, this is the new shape of this genocide, where you have what the Americans call transnational repression, which Australians and UK people may say it's foreign intervention. So transnational repression is the new shape of these atrocity crimes, where I have already said that Vichar has been martyred in Canada, Paramveer Singh was martyred in Pakistan. There are threats to life as well elsewhere. So transnational repression also what we need to understand is not only the assassination attempts. Transnational repression is not only plotting to kill somebody, it's more than that. Earlier this year I joined on the expert committee of the Freedom House, which is one of the greatest think tanks in the US. We are consistently trying for the policymaker to understand that transnational repression is also harassment and physical assaults and attempted kidnapping, forcing or coercing victims to return to the home countries, detaining family members in the home country, freezing financial assets, online disinformation campaigns. So, these words, everything I'm speaking about is happening to the Sikhs. Somebody want to go back to India to meet their parents or see their family, their visas are denied. People have some property in India, they are at the threat that this will be seized. And a lot of this information. Only a few years ago at the UN, an NGO presented us a case where India was running these fake media websites who were spreading hate against the Sikhs, minority communities, and these were all fake media organizations. And as I already talked about by Hakeem Singh Vichar and Ranveer Singh Panjwar. And as we have recently found out as well that Indian authorities have used spyware and online harassment campaigns. And as I told you, the Brussels-based NGO has told that there was a 15-year-old operation of Government of India of these campaigns of defaming. So these are some of my recommendations for Australia, specifically the Parliament. As I already said, the Parliament of Australia should recognize Sikh Genocide, 1984 to 1995. I'm not dating it to 1984. It started in 1984, and it lasted for a decade. Australia should put religious freedom and human rights at the heart of all trade, aid, and diplomatic interactions with India. Australia should pass legislation to address gaps in responses to transnational repression, or, if you want to say it in Australian, economy intervention. This includes codifying the definition of transnational repression, ensuring government officials who may encounter perpetrator or victims of transnational repression receive the training necessary to recognize and respond to the problem, and strengthening sanctions authorities to make it easier to hold perpetrators to accountability. Australia should effectively deal with transnational repression and lobbying for the states which violate human rights and religious freedom should be made unlawful. This is a very important point. There are so many organizations which work with these repressive regimes. We need to look into those. And the group that raised funds for Australians from Australian citizens and support the hate campaigns abroad should be banned from operating in Australia. I assume there are so many Vichar organizations in US, in Canada, in UK. Australia must have those Vichar organizations here too, which raises funds. They have very nice mainstream names, but what they do, they raise funds under those nice names and send that money to India to persecute the Sikhs and other religious minority communities. Such an attitude is not acceptable in any safe country. So Australia should watch all these organizations and ban them. And thank you all.
Many thanks for your excellent informative speech, Dr. Juma. And on behalf of the Australian Sikh community, thank you once more for being here. Our community very much appreciates your efforts and your words. For our next speaker, we have a civil and environmental engineer, an academic by trade, someone who is tackling climate change, inequality, and divisive politics, with an excellent recently written book, which I highly recommend. Senator Marian Baruch.
Sat Sri Akal, good afternoon, salam. I will start by acknowledging the sovereign owners of the lands we gathered on, the Nanawal and the Nemu people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. It is such a privilege and an honor to be here with you. Torne Varga, मैं भी पंजाबी हाँ, लाहौर इस पली बड़ी सी, And I can't tell you how amazing it is to see you all here in the People's House. And I also do want to acknowledge that the genocide that happened against First Nations people has not been acknowledged in this country either. The Palestinians at this point in time are going through a genocide, which is also being ignored by the government of this country. मैं बहुत सी जगहों के genocide हो गया था, and कौन दस नहीं सकते, कौन नहीं पता है the pain that the Sikh community went through, the killing, the maiming, the violence, the displacement, and it is shameful that hasn't been acknowledged and recognized. So I do want to pay my tribute and honor people who faced that violence in those years. But I also want to put on the table, as Dr. Chima has said, that vilification, that harassment, and that violence continues on to this day. In India, but also we have seen how that harassment continues on in other countries where the Sikh community lives as well. And it's absolutely true to say that there can be no peace without justice. And that we should be doing all we can to ensure that justice should be done for the Sikh community and for every other community around the world who is facing vilification, racism, and harassment and violence. And I'm proud to say that in this country, the Greens are the only party that have an anti-racism portfolio, and that are serious about tackling the issues of racism, and they are serious about making sure that marginalized communities in this country have the same equality that others have. And that equality does mean supporting and being in solidarity with the Sikh community in their demands for justice. And I must apologize as well, it is Senate estimate, so we're running in and out of questioning governments on various things, so I will have to go really soon. But I do want to say to you, I cannot express my gratitude to you for being fearless in standing up for justice and demanding what is rightfully yours. And I can assure you that the Greens are with you, because the Greens will always stand up for human rights and for abuses of human rights, no matter when they happen or where they happen. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for coming here to actually raise this issue. That's Vichar.
Thank you once again, Senator Baruch, for your touching words. Our next speaker, Udrit Kaur Benibal, has recently graduated from the University of Sydney with a major in marketing and public relations. She is a proud young Sikh woman and wishes to empower women by carrying their Sikh identity forward. She is here today with her family to share a symbolic piece on behalf of her younger brother, who is currently studying at the University of California, Berkeley in the States. Come on down.
Good afternoon, honourable guests. My name is Udrit Benibal. It is great to be gathered here today to platform such a monumental tragedy in Sikh history, the 1984 Sikh Genocide. The fictional narrative I am about to read is called The Light of Word. It is composed by my younger brother, Vichar. V was born and raised in Sydney like myself, attended the King's School, and is now currently studying business administration and economics abroad in the USA at UC Berkeley Haas Business School. V has always and continues to keep his Sikh faith and the principle of seva, selfless service, close to his heart. His aim is to compose an emotionally resonant piece that encapsulates the multitude of tragic experiences faced by Sikhs in 1984, distilling them into a single narrative that honors their voices and resilience. V believes, and so do I, that understanding is the first step to acknowledgement. And he wants this narrative to create that tangible awareness. He especially seeks to connect with Sikh youth in Western countries, wanting us all to be courageous enough to speak on our proud Sikh faith and believe in ourselves to have an impact regardless of what anyone says. I welcome and invite you to the light of word. Amrit wakes to the same nightmare, the crack of a cricket bat on broken roofs. From his flat, Amrit gazes across Delhi. Her streets glow with rickshaws, simmer with frying barnacle, marinate with the sweat of 20 million bodies. Ancient Delhi, overrun by her new children, free of the past. Yet even 4 decades later, the harrowed eyes of Zora linger, inescapable. The pen, the notebook await. And Amrit writes. 1 hour passes. His fingers tremble. His eyes burn to candles and a watchful moon. But as night crawls on, things seem colder and harsher than before. The moon, the old scriptures, nothing is helping. How can we expect the Guru's grace to dispel the darkness within him? How can the moon of wisdom give him strength when he is tormented so? Acceptance, reads the Guru Granth, is the first step to grief. Yet, Amrit cannot accept what has already passed. The pen is a weapon of lies, but the lies evaporate, leaving only the truth. Word is on the street. Its tentacles reach past the towers of temples, onto streets and into the lips of orphan boys who pass it to ears of men whose teeth are stained orange with balm. Delhi watches, waits. She sighs, heavy with the anticipation of violence witnessed so many times. A city of chaos, longing for peace. Across India, radios crackle with fear. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi has been assassinated by Sikh bodyguards. Just months after Gandhi ordered raids on the Golden Temple, the Sikhs gained retribution. Old wounds reopened. Amrit wanders down Rebel streets. Beside him, Zora touches his turban self-consciously. Reproachful eyes glare. Rumors of unfaithful Sikh bodyguards, the tentacles tighten. Above, the moon has sharpened into a crescent, the sky ready to tear at Amrit's heart. Then, a man in an Amrika kurta spits at them. "Bloody Sikhs!" he barks. Eyes downturned, the two Sikhs run. They pace down alleyways, through thick smoke that boils out of open kitchens and sears their eyes. Around the corner then, there are more. Oi, these two came straight to us. The chanting of men gains momentum. They're in circles. Zora's turban unravels, exposing dark hair beneath. He is thrown to the ground. Blood on the pavement, it flows into gutters down the alley. Delhi drinks, yet again, the red tide is familiar to her as the current of the river Ganges. Amrit watches. A cricket bat cracks onto Zora's ribs. Once, twice, he turns away. Crack. And then Amrit runs, away from the horror. With each step, Zora's wheezing fades. The moon hovers above, its eyes of judgment piercing into Amrit's soul. The truth escapes, propelling his hand, not as drizzles of memories, but a torrential downpour, spilling onto the pages. Zora's cries, the blood, Amrit's selfishness, the paper, his confession, his atonement, redemption. Finally, after all these years, Amrit surveys the city. Delhi's ancient, swollen streets, unable to register a single life lost. But Amrit's words catch Zora's spirit, his hands restoring a life. Amrit gazes reassuringly at the Guru Granth Sahib and thinks of the many Zoras in Delhi, cruel stories untold. He prepares a notebook for tomorrow. Revive these stories, he will. The moon's power is diffused through its gentle light of peace. High above, it beams. Watchful, gibbous, darkness is dispelled. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that touching speech. And on behalf of everybody present here, please pass our thanks on to your brother as well for writing that excellent piece. Our next speaker has actually come all the way from Canada to join us here today. Bhai Maninder Singh has been active in Sikh issues and leadership roles for almost 20 years now. He currently serves as the chair and the spokesperson for the Sikh Federation of Canada and the spokesperson for the British Columbia Laborers Council. He is a Master of Arts in Leadership Studies from the University of Guelph and resides currently in Surrey, British Columbia. Please welcome to the stage Bhai Maninder Singh.
एक सिख जो एहसान साथ संग पंजी परमेश्वर परमेश्वर के रूप में प्रगटी रूप प्यारी खालसा जी कोई फतेह मान करने वाहिगुरू जी का खालसा वाहिगुरू जी की फतेह। Along with that, I'd also like to acknowledge that I come to you from the unceded and occupied territories of the Fulton, Cassie, and Sanjhe First Nations in what is now British Columbia, Canada. Recognition of lost lands and stolen lands is just a tipping point of understanding genocide, cultural genocide, environmental degradation and genocide, and the various forms of genocide that are before us today, both on this land, in Canada, and all the way back to Vicha. 40 years ago, it started with a single scream. It was a scream that symbolized desperation, unimaginable agony for what was to come. It was the scream of a man, a woman, or a child. We'll never know. Perhaps it was the scream of a sick man as he was doused in kerosene, a tire put around his neck, and set ablaze while he was still alive. Perhaps it was the desperate cry of a child thrown to the ground and then stoned to death at a rock crushing their head. Perhaps it was the resilient yet desperate scream of a sick child, a teenage girl, an elderly woman, as she was being gang raped by mobs throughout India. We'll never know for certain where the first scream came from. One thing we do know for certain is that it was followed by tens of thousands of similar screams over that first week of November 1984 in the planned, orchestrated, and executed genocide of Sikhs across India by the Indian government. The scream is a reminder of the brutality and the brutal nature that humanity can take when governments and those in power allow for atrocities like this to take place, and also help manipulate them into a political situation for their benefit. This should never be underscored that the idea of never again can only be possible with the sovereignty of a community and a nation of people, and in the Sikh case, in the modern context of Punjab, Palestine. The idea of dehumanization, I'd like to give you an idea of Captain Richard Henry Pratt from the United States in the late 1800s. Captain Richard Pratt was an Army officer in the United States Army. He is known for, most often, a phrase that should send chills down the spines of every individual that is in this room and beyond. He coined the phrase, "Kill the man, save the, kill the Indian, save the man." At the time in North America, when residential schools were being formed, Captain Pratt was of the opinion that you can leach the Indianness, leach the cultural, linguistic faith out of an individual and save the man by Christianizing. That laid the foundation for over 150 residential schools in the United States, hundreds of residential schools in Canada, that led to the destruction of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of First Nations families, set in motion trauma that would last generation upon generation. The importance of this in the context of June and November of 1984 is that in a similar way what Sikhs are facing right now is not just November of 1984 and June of 1984 is what we've heard. These were not solely moments in time. November 1984 is a continuation of violence that started in 1947. 1947 is a continuation of violence that started in 1849. And up until the present day, the continuation of that violence has shown its form in 1984. It's shown its form beyond that all up until the present day in various forms. Sikhs face a cultural genocide. The way you look, your identity, the way you dress, symbolically what is important to you, everything is under attack in India, and you know this. We face a linguistic genocide. From the Punjabi Suba movement, the denial of Punjabi rights, the attacks on the Punjabi language, and an attack on the Punjabi language is a direct direct attack on Gurmukhi and on Guru Granth Sahib Ji and our ability to connect as Sikhs in this world. We face an environmental genocide of the land that we call our home. There's an ecocide happening in Punjab. There's water degradation going on in Punjab. The Green Revolution, which was supposed to so-called be for the benefit of Punjab, was the degradation of Punjab's land for the next 40 years up until today, which has caused a mass migration of our youth to leave Punjab because of a lack of opportunity and investment in Punjab. And you can go one step further and talk about a drug epidemic in the form of a genocide, which the Indian state both orchestrates and inflicts upon Punjab in mass numbers to ensure that no Sikh in Punjab, no Punjabi in Punjab is able to stand up against oppression against India. These are the factors that we're dealing with today as Sikhs, not only living in Punjab, but those of us that are connected to Punjab, for whatever reason, being born and raised in outside countries like Canada and Australia and America, in the diaspora. I'd like to read you some things that I'm going to be speaking about. Now we'll read them in direct context and quote, for the sole purpose that these things are recorded in spaces like this. They are utilized by those that would undermine humanity and sovereignty of individuals, and they would also go as far as politicizing them to then go into a lobby effort to ensure events like this don't take place. That has already taken place before we even set foot in this room. And you can be assured with the way India's transnational repression is happening across the world, that it will happen once you leave this room. That is the reality that we have to accept. That is the battleground that has been set. I quote Patricia Grossman from 1991, Punjab in Crisis from Human Rights Watch. Despite numerous credible eyewitness accounts that identified many of those involved in the violence, including police and politicians, in the months following the killings, the government sought no prosecutions, no indictments of any persons, including officials accused of murder, arson, and rape. This is important for those of us that are in this room right now to understand that how India actually operates. The silencing of dissenting voices, any legitimate form of dissent is met with absolute violence in many different forms. The Sikh coalition quotes from October 31st to November 3rd, 1984, thousands of Sikhs throughout India were hunted and murdered by mobs following the assassination of Indira Gandhi. The government of India and then ruling party unleashed this campaign of premeditated, organized violence, including killings, sexual and gender-based violence, torture, the desecration and destruction of gurdwaras and libraries, and the destruction of Sikh homes and businesses with the goal of eliminating Sikhs from Delhi and other cities throughout India. As Dr. Chima has already laid out, the stages of a genocide to kill or to destroy, fully or in part, an entire nation of people. All of these quotes from 1984 and beyond will justify when Sikhs say that this was a genocide. This was not a riot. This wasn't something that happened spontaneously. This was premeditated and orchestrated and executed by the Indian state, whether or not Mrs. Gandhi would have been assassinated or not. This was going to take place anyways, post-June of 1984, and the mass atrocities that happened at the Rothschild and Amritsar. When we say that the events of 1984 are not isolated, they're not to be taken in a silo, they're not to be taken as a one-off. The continuation of all of that genocide is before us today. I'd like to point something out to you here, because we often put our allegiance and our faith in institutions and organizations that maybe don't have our best interests at heart. The United Nations is often seen as an international force, where justice will be delivered. This is proven to be problematic in many instances, especially for those engaged in struggles of sovereignty and existence. Genocide prevention and the responsibility to protect is an entire UN office. following the atrocities committed in the 1990s in the Balkans, which the international community failed to prevent, the international community engaged in a conversation as to how they could do better in the future. I'd like to read you a couple of quotes from Kofi Annan at the time, who was the Secretary General of the UN. In September of 1999, while presenting his annual report at the United General Assembly, Kofi Annan reflected on the prospects for human security and intervention in the next century, and challenged member states to find common ground in upholding the principles of the Charter and acting in defense of common humanity. I quote, he repeated the challenge in his 2000 Millennium Report. If humanitarian intervention is indeed an unacceptable assault on the sovereignty of a nation, how then should we respond to a Rwanda or other, to the gross and systematic violation of human rights that offend every precept of our common humanity? The question of territorial integrity and a nation's sovereignty will undermine the ability of the United Nations time and time again to act swiftly and accordingly to protect the interests of those that are being engaged in genocide by states and often their own state. Kofi Annan's challenge was uptaken. It was taken up by the International Convention on Intervention and State Sovereignty. And it was set up to actually the Canadian government, which at the end of 2001 issued a report entitled The Responsibility to Protect. The concept of this report was inspired by Francis Deng's idea that the state sovereignty as a responsibility, not just an inherent right. That a state had the responsibility to protect its own citizens from dehumanization, from genocide, from mass violence, but also at the same time, it's other states that have a reciprocal responsibility as well. That their responsibility is that if a country is not able to uphold that responsibility to its own citizens, that they must mobilize and protect those human beings from genocide. The UN Summit in 2005 approved this. I bring this up for a reason. I will read you now paragraphs 138 and 139 from the 2005 World Summit Outcome Document. Heads of state and government affirmed the responsibility to protect their own populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, and accepted a collective responsibility to encourage and help each other uphold this commitment. They also declared their preparedness to take timely and decisive action in accordance with the United Nations Charter and in cooperation with relevant regional organizations when national authorities manifestly fail to protect their populations. Now, since 2005, how many of us in this room can say that the United Nations or partner regional organizations have fulfilled this responsibility? Where have they fulfilled it? It definitely doesn't mean we leave those spaces unoccupied, but we cannot allow all of our eggs to be in one basket and rely on the United Nations or regional organizations to deliver this type of justice. What is the reality of these motions and documents? They're often commitments that clash between economic trade and diplomatic needs that countries have with one another. And what does this lead to? This leads to a Palestine that we've seen develop in the last year or so. Hundreds of thousands murdered, hundreds of thousands not found, millions displaced. Where is the responsibility there? Where is the responsibility in extreme cases of violence and genocide of the Rohingya population, with Yazidis, with Turkmens? Where is the United Nations and these regional organizations? So where should Sikhs look to? Where has the United Nations and its partner organizations been since 1984 on the Sikh Genocide? Where have governments sided repeatedly with India? Where are these diplomatic tensions taking us now? There is always a path. The question is, which path do we take? For the Sikh responsibility is always to humanity, sabat. Our foundation is rooted in Garibi Rakya Jarwani Pakya, protection of the weak and the oppressed, destruction of the tyrant and the oppressor. And that is what we move to. There is no mayusi or depression here for the Sikh community. We simply find a path as our elders have for times immemorial. I've stated that this is a continuation of 1984. I'm going to give you a few reasons why I believe so. In the report, Protecting Killers, a policy of impunity in Punjab, India, and I continuously will quote and read these quotes. So those that are outside of this room, or perhaps in this room, that want to use this for their own political benefit, to malign the Australian Sikh community, to prevent events like this from happening in the future, that we are speaking to international organizations and media that have come to these conclusions and these revelations. These are things that are in the public record. They cannot be disputed. From 1984 to 1995, the Indian government ordered counterinsurgency operations that led to the arbitrary detention, torture, extrajudicial execution, and enforced disappearances of thousands of Sikhs in Punjab. The report further notes, police abducted young Sikh men on suspicion that they were involved in militancy, often in the presence of witnesses, yet later deny having them in custody. Most of the victims of such enforced disappearances are believed to have been killed. To hide the evidence of their crimes, security forces secretly disposed of the bodies, as Dr. Chima has pointed out, by dumping them in rivers that move towards either Rajasthan or towards the Pakistan side, or by usually cremating them without any identity or record kept. This is a continuation of the same genocide and violence from November of 1984, as Human Rights Watch points out to 1995. In that same vein, let's continue. December 1996, the Supreme Court of India orders the National Human Rights Commission in India to probe 2,097 bodies that were found at cremation sites that had no identity. It took 16 years. Justice denied is often related to justice delayed. It took 16 years, but in April of 2012, 15 years later, acceptance of 1,513 of those bodies was given to extrajudicial murder at the hands of the Indian state. No trials, no accountability. The justice that the Sikh community was supposedly going to be delivered was in the form of reparations. Reparational payments in the form of 28 crore rupiah that was to be dispersed to the 1,513 families who lost a child. I have a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old at home. Many of you have children yourselves. Many of you will have them in the future. I hope there's no one in this room that has lost a child to this violence, but I can't be sure of that either. Imagine combing your child's hair in the morning, putting their backpack on and getting them ready to go to school, sending them out that front door and only later finding out that was the last time you were going to see them. For days they would disappear. You might be lucky enough to find their body, but in most cases, like these 1,513, their bodies weren't even found or given back to their families. And then justice from the Indian state is a few $1,000s in Australian currency to say go home, justice has been delivered. Would you accept this justice? Then how as a community are we prepared to get justice from the Indian state? Justice is delivered through sovereignty. Justice is delivered through the ability to shape your own future, to determine your own destiny, to safeguard your interests and the interests of your people. Not for the sake that you're better than anyone, but definitely because you are no less than anyone. And what you bring to this world, what Guru Nanak Sahib brought to this world, the idea of Sarvata Pala, the betterment and the upliftment of all, you're caretakers entrusted with that responsibility. That is why you exist, and that is why sovereignty is the absolute necessity. that we have to move forward with as a community. This is the continuation I speak of when it comes to 1984 to 1995 and 1995 up until the present day. I move finally into my closing, and I speak to actually what is happening today. I'm going to speak to the reality of Sikhs face not only in Canada, but somewhat in Australia as well, because that should be the purpose today. We can reflect on the past, but if we don't change the course of the future, we're repeating that past again. It will come before us. And it has come before us in Canada in the violent assassination of Vichar. It was supposed to come in the violent assassination of Vichar from Sikhs for Justice in the United States. And it may have come to the soil of this country in Australia as well, as the Sikh community moves against Indian transnational oppression and foreign interference that's happening in this country. In 2022, myself and Vichar were given duties to warn of imminent threat of assassination against our lives. That was in July of 2022. The reason and the information around it was very limited, but it was very obvious that the Indian state was at work. Almost 1 year later, many of these warnings later to Vichar Singh on June 18, 2023, was gunned down in a Gurdwara Sahib parking lot in Surrey, BC. When thousands of other Sikhs, Sangat congregation was there, assembled men, women, and children. This was not a chance murder, this wasn't a local level dispute. This was the Indian state formally attempting to quash any form of legitimate dissent, silencing dissenting voices, and taking that violence that everyone thought was limited to the Indian state of Punjab and bringing it into a country like Canada. There's a lack of response on behalf of the Canadian state in understanding the threat that India posed. And the action that the Canadian system has taken now on foreign interference commissions and calling India out is praiseworthy, but it's a little bit late. We would urge those in the Australian government and parliament and elected representatives to never allow that type of situation to exist here. And I'll get into why that type of a situation is not only brewing here, but India has firmly planted its foot on Australian soil as well. I'd like to talk to you about what the India's interference in Canada and the Foreign Interference Commission in Canada has found, just very shortly. Canada's security and intelligence agencies drafted summaries of intelligence for the Foreign Interference Commission, and I quote, "In these documents, the agencies are unequivocally clear that India views any and all advocacy for Palestine as a seditious threat that requires a security-based response at the highest level. They believe that political speech is a criminal act and label it extremism and attempt to manufacture a narrative in Canada. This is on the record at the Foreign Interference Commission." This is not me stating this is Canada's security agency stating this. Further, disinformation. After years of disinformation, India has used manufactured narrative to justify its targeted assassinations of Sikh leadership. Primarily what we know by Vichar and by Vichar. But in the indictment in the United States, it was very clear that these were just two of many other targets and 3 to 4 other high-level Sikh leadership targets that were based in Canada as well. And as recently as last week, as acknowledged by Deputy Minister Morrison, these violent attacks were authorized, supervised, and directed by individuals at the highest level of the Indian government, namely Amit Shah. It is absolutely imperative and important when having these conversations around genocide, around transnational repression, to not only name our own, like Vichar Singh, but also to name them. Who are the perpetrators? We cannot dilute our language. We cannot compromise our words. Dilution of the Sikh sovereignty movement to simply a human rights issue cannot suffice in the modern day. It would be a limitation on our ability to move forward as a Guru Panth, and it cannot be allowed to happen. We have to be able to hold our heads high. Raj Karega Khalsa was not simply a slogan. It was a hukum or an order from Guru Sahib. That is primary for us. So as much as we are in these spaces, we are in these rooms, it's imperative that the responsibility is on our shoulders to choose that language that aligns with Sikh sovereignty, with Sikh itihas, and the Qurbaniya and the bloodshed our people have suffered for hundreds of years. We are here because of them, and future generations will be in these spaces, but more importantly in Gurdwara and Sangat spaces because of us. I'd like to read you out something, and I'd like you to just digest this. And I quote, India conducts intelligence operations in Canada at two levels, directly through its consulates in Toronto and Vancouver, and indirectly through infiltration of the Canadian Sikh community. India's target is a well-organized international Sikh lobby that is the financial, intellectual, and administrative backbone of the drive for our homeland in Punjab. According to the sources, India's intelligence activities in Canada include the spreading of false information, the use of paid informers, and the instigation of activities to discredit the Sikh separatist movement, end quote. This is not something that was quoted a year ago. This is not something that was quoted 6 months ago in the current diplomatic row that's happening between Canada and India. This is from the Globe and Mail, a major Canadian news outlet, on the 28th of November, 1984, which shows us for 40 years Canadian media and the Canadian government is aware of India's foreign interference in Canada. And which also shows us that that interference went completely unchecked and almost 40 years later leading to the Shahidi and the assassination of Bhai Hardeep Singh Nijjar at Guru Nanak Sikh Gurdwara on June 18, 2023. And quickly, I'd like to give you an example of how India coerces, how they threaten, how they manipulate, how they use paid informers, just with one example. Intelligence reports, again, this is on the record, in a letter from the Ministry of Immigration in May 30th, 2018. Intelligence reports identified an individual only by the letters of A.B., who works for the Indian media. Between 2009 and 2015, this individual had over 25 meetings with the Research and Analysis Wing, which we commonly know as RAW. And in this letter, I quote, the immigration minister saying, you stated that you were tasked by RAW to covertly influence Canadian government representatives and agencies on behalf of the Indian government. You stated that you were told to identify random Caucasian politicians and attempt to direct them into supporting issues that impacted India. You stated that the guidance from RAW included that you were to provide financial assistance and propaganda material to politicians in order to exert influence over them. And what was the reason for this? And I quote, one of your tasks was to convince politicians that funding from Canada was being sent by the Sikh community to Pakistan to support terrorism, according to the letter dated May 30th, 2018. This is to feed the narrative that Sikh extremists exist in these diaspora countries, that there are funding extremist elements or militant elements in India, and it's manufactured propaganda at its best on behalf of the Indian government. And quickly, I would like to speak to Australia, and that's why you're here. Australia has been a target of India's campaign on transnational repression, which you all are well aware of. Media reports have alleged that the ASIO expelled a nest of spies from India in 2020. These activities that they were expelled for included monitoring members of the diaspora Sikh community and attempting to cultivate relationships with politicians and officials, similar to what I just said about Canada. Queensland police have speculated that pro-Palestinian graffiti attacks on Hindu temples in Brisbane may have been perpetrated to attract attention to the Sikh separatist group Sikhs for Justice and believed to be conducted as a false flag operation via the Indian government. Again, similar to Canada. But unlike Canada, the United States and Germany, which have called out or prosecuted Indian intelligence assets, Australia has yet to officially implicate India, and it's needed, as per its obligations as a signatory to the Declaration on Principles to Combat Transnational Oppression, to, I quote, publicly and privately call out perpetrators of transnational repression. This is not only something that should be done because it's the right thing to do, there is an obligation for elected officials in this country to call it out. Not doing so allows India to evade accountability at the international stage, and it's the undermining of Australian sovereignty and the liberties of its citizens. The alarming evidence from Canada should be an impetus for Australia to act quickly and swiftly to stop this transnational oppression. As I've stated before in the ABC documentary for foreign interference of Indian agents in Australia, India is already here. Australia has to decide what to do next. And finally, I'd like to end on something that is more from a Sikh perspective. We will not beg and plead our case to anyone. That is not how we do things. We'll move for our sovereignty in the ways of our people, where we follow our moral and ethical compass given to us by our Guru. We're not individuals that go out and oppress people. We are not individuals that inflict violence on people. We have rules of engagement that we follow very, very closely. And this is one of those engagements. Being able to come into spaces like this and speak as Sikhs without diluting or compromising our position. This is a life and death situation for the Sikh community internationally, but very much so for those in Punjab. And the sovereignty of many other countries right now is being undermined in India, so the reaction from politicians that are in this room, were in this room, or in future times will be in these rooms is imperative. I leave you with this from one Sikh to another. The Sikh historian once said that the first casualty of the Indian independence movement for Sikhs beyond just loss of life was the ability for Sikhs to think no longer in terms of sovereignty and to start thinking in a larger context of being small Hissas or a small part of a larger Indian independence movement. A struggle for Sikhs that was to see Desh Azad Manaya, and we forgot it was Desh Punjab. The sacrifices our Bujurgs made was for Desh Punjab, was for Sikh principles, was for Sarvata. What we received for that was 75 years of genocide, 75 years of discrimination, 75 years of destruction of our identity, 75 years of destruction of Punjab as a land. This for the price we paid in blood. And if we are ever to stick to the principle of never again, I want to be unequivocally clear here when I say this. For many communities like the Sikh community, never again is in terms of our ability to reclaim our sovereignty, to start speaking as sovereigns, and moving towards Punjab, Palestine as being a sovereign state where we can determine the destiny of our generation now and generations to come. Thank you. Bye, Vichar Khalsa. Bye, Vichar.
Thank you for your speech, Melinda, and thank you for sharing your insights, knowledge and support for the Australian Sikh community. I mentioned it at the beginning of the speech as well, but if we could please refrain from any form of political activism in this sort of a stage. We're here today as a commemoration event. We're here today to express unity and solidarity, and that would be very much appreciated. Before we move to our last speaker for the day. I would like to acknowledge two people who've been instrumental in organising the events for today. We've got Bhai Amrit Singh, wherever you may be in the crowd, for Labour, and Bhai Harkirat Singh Ajnoha for the Greens. So thank you for your efforts in helping to organise the day today. Our last speech of the day is going to be some concluding remarks from a representative of the Australian Sikh Association, who have worked tirelessly to organise this day. I'd like to call to the stage ASA Company Secretary, Nishan Singh.
दिलिए दयाला वेख तेज चो उबलदा नहीं दिलिए दयाला वेख देख चो उबलदा नहीं अजे भी तेरा दिल ना ठहरे अजे भी तेरा दिल ना ठहरे वाहिगुरु जी का खालसा श्री वाहिगुरु जी की फतेह। आई एम वेरी सॉरी कि मैं स्पीच देनी सी। मैनू मेरे भरावां ने बड़ा प्रॉमिस किया सीगा कि माहौल बड़ा ठंडा ते ठीक रहेगा, पर हुण लास्ट विच आके जो होया मैं उस तो खुश नहीं। असी भरावां ने रल के बड़ी मेहनत की सी। पिछले 2 महीनों तो असी कंटिन्यूअस ते काम कर रहे सी। असी एक वीर नूं बड़े ध्यान दे नाल स्नेहा घल्लिया। एक जेनोसाइड ही कल्ली साडा एडा वड्डा मुद्दा है कि जे असीं इहनूं तरीके दे नाल दुनिया दे विच प्रेजेंट कर लईए ते सानूं होर कोई मुद्दे दी लोड़ नहीं, पर इस मुद्दे तो नूं खत्म करने लई होर मुद्दे विच लियाई जांदे ने। सो ये मुद्दा साडे तो खत्म हुंदा जांदा है। सो अगेन आई एम नॉट डिलीवरिंग माय स्पीच टुडे, सॉरी। वाहिगुरु जी का खालसा श्री वाहिगुरु जी की फतेह।
सॉरी महाराज जी, तुसीं सीट ले लो, ये गल नहीं है कोई चीज़ डिस्कस करना। भाजी मैं तुहानूं रिक्वेस्ट कर रहा सीट ले लो तुसीं, ठीक है? पहले तुसीं उन्होंने टाइम दिता ना बोलने वास्ते। भाई ये स्पीच एक थोड़ी स्पीच का टाइम नहीं है। That brings to an end, to a conclusion, our official proceedings for today. I want to thank all of our speakers.
वाहिगुरु जी का खालसा वाहिगुरु जी की फतेह। जी प्रेजेंटेशन सी वो पार्लियामेंटेरियंस में सी ते उन्होंने देखी और देख के चले गए रिकमेंडेशन। उन क्वेश्चन दे दिए गला कर देखो, they say all is well which ends well। ये कहानी ਆਪਾਂ जिथे इकट्ठे हुए हैं अपने शहीदां ਨੂੰ श्रद्धांजलि देनी, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ याद करना। कोई एक इधर समागम छठी ये चलता पंगे न पाइए प्रोग्राम पर, because world is watching us। This is what your enemy want you to do, divide। एक एक ਨੂੰ अपन कर करे उसका हुक्म करे, but see where you are sitting। This is a parliament, this is called the great court where the world leader speaks। so यदि अपनी एक सैनिटी है, ये पार्लियामेंट हाउस है, हाउस ऑफ रिप्रेजेंटेटिव है, जिथे पूरे ऑस्ट्रेलिया के लोगों ने लैंड करके कर ਆਪਾਂ इन्हीं रूम छड़िए कल में सानू दोबारा कॉन्फ्रेंस करना। ये ना हो कि कल ਨੂੰ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਹੀਏ ਕਿ ਸਾਈਡ ਤੇ ਕੁਝ ਕਰਨਾ ਪਿਆ ਤਾਂ ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਆ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੀ ਇੱਥੇ ਲੜਾ ਕਰਨੀ ਆ ਇੱਕ ਦੂਸਰੇ ਦੇ ਜਿੰਦਰ ਤੱਕ ਨਹੀਂ ਆ, ਪਰ ਇਹ ਕਰਨਾ ਕਰਦਾ ਜਾਂਦਾ। ਜੇ ਇਸ ਪਾਰਲੀਮੈਂਟ 'ਚ ਖਲੋ ਕੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਰਾਈਟ ਆਫ ਸੈਲਫ ਡਿਟਰਮੀਨੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ, ਆਪਣਾ ਪਾਰਲੀਮੈਂਟ ਬਣਾਉਣ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ, ਤੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਉਣ ਦਾ ਮਕਸਦ ਕੋਈ ਨਹੀਂ। ਸਿੱਖ ਜੈਨੋਸਾਈਡ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਜੈਨੋਸਾਈਡ ਹੋਈ ਸੀ ਐਵੇਂ ਸੀ, ਉਹ ਜਾਨਵਰ ਵੀ ਸੀ ਜਿਹਨਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਕੱਟਿਆ ਵੱਢਿਆ ਮਾਰਿਆ ਤੇ ਉੱਧਰ ਗਏ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਯਾਦ ਕਰਨ ਤੇ ਡਰ ਅੱਗੇ ਟੁਰਨ ਦਿੰਦਾ। ਇਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੋਈ ਇਹਦੇ ਦੀ ਪ੍ਰਸਤੀ ਕਬਰ ਪ੍ਰਸਤੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗੀ ਸੀ ਵੀ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਕੋਈ ਮਰਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਕੋਈ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਦੀਵਾ ਬਾਲ ਦਿਆ ਉਹਦੇ ਲਈ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਸ਼ਰਧਾਂਜਲੀ ਦੇ ਕੇ ਪ੍ਰਾਰਥਨਾ ਕਰਕੇ ਅੱਗੇ ਰਾਹ ਪਾਓ। ਸਿੰਘੋ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਾਣਾ ਕਿਸੇ ਮਕਸਦ ਲਈ ਨਹੀਂ। ਜੈਨੋਸਾਈਡ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੋ ਯਾਦ ਰੱਖੋ, ਖਾਲਿਸਤਾਨੀ ਨੌਨ ਖਾਲਿਸਤਾਨੀ ਪਾਪਾ ਪੇਂਡੂ ਇਹ ਤੁਹਾਡੀਆਂ ਆਪਣੀਆਂ ਰਾਈਟਸ ਹੈ। ਜਿਹੜਾ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਦੁਸ਼ਮਣ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਸਿਰਫ ਸਿੱਖ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹਨੂੰ 1984 ਚ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੋਇਆ ਸੀ, ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਪ੍ਰੈਜ਼ੀਡੈਂਟ ਆਫ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਤੇ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੋਇਆ ਸੀ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਟਾਊਨ ਸੀਗਾ ਇੰਦਰਾ ਗਾਂਧੀ ਦਾ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਸਿੱਖ ਸੀ। ਜਿਹੜੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਹਜੇ ਜੰਮੇ ਸੀ ਨਾ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਨਾਮ ਨਹੀਂ ਰੱਖੇ ਗਏ ਹਜੇ ਸਰਕਾਰਾਂ ਚ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਕਾਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਸਿਖਾਇਆ, ਨਿਊ ਬੋਰਨ ਬੇਬੀਜ਼, ਉਹ ਹਸਪਤਾਲ ਚੱਕ ਕੇ ਉਹ ਬੱਚੇ ਨਿਊ ਬੋਰਨ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਦਾ ਅਜੇ ਨਾਮ ਕੋਈ ਨਾ ਸਿੰਘ ਸੀਗਾ ਨਾ ਕੌਰ ਸੀਗਾ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕਿਹੜਾ ਸਾਲ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਸੀ। ਕਿਸੇ ਨੇ ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਵੀ ਇਹਦਾ ਪਿਓ ਖਾਲਿਸਤਾਨ ਦਾ ਪ੍ਰਚਾਰਕ ਹੈ, ਇਹਦਾ ਪਿਓ ਪਾਪਾ ਰਿਹਾ ਪੇਂਡੂ ਆ, ਸਿਰਫ ਉਹਦੀ ਪਛਾਣ ਸੀ ਸਿੱਖ, ਆਪਣੀ ਪਛਾਣ ਸਿਰਫ ਸਿੱਖੀ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਪਛਾਣ ਬਚਾਉਣ ਦਾ ਕੋਈ ਨਾ ਆਪਣਾ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ। ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਦਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ।
Thank you for putting it so simply and eloquently, Dr. Juma. I do have Brian Chancellor's speech with me here today, and he's not been able to talk to a few of the events that have happened today, but I will share his words on behalf of him to thank the Australian Sikh Association for what they've done in putting together an event like this on a stage like this. Vaiguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaiguru Ji Ki Fateh. Distinguished guests, respected community leaders, friends and fellow attendees. As the Company Secretary of the Australian Sikh Association, I stand before you with deep humility and gratitude to extend a heartfelt vote of thanks on behalf of our organisation and the global Sikh community. Your presence today in Canberra's Parliament House gives voice to the voiceless and strength to those whose memories we honour. We are gathered here not merely to recount history, but to reflect on the humanity that binds us, the justice we seek, and the courage we must uphold. The tragic events of 1984 were not just an attack on Sikhs, but on the values of compassion, of justice, and human dignity, which are universal. In remembering those lost and those who endured, we also pledge to continue to advocate for truth, for peace, and a world where such atrocities are never forgotten nor repeated. Our special thanks go out to the Honourable Members of Parliament, to government officials, and the tireless defenders of human rights who have joined us today. We are blessed to have leaders, scholars and advocates from Australia and worldwide, many of whom have travelled great distances to be with us today. Your unwavering commitment reminds us that the fight for justice is collective and demands community unity and presence that brings both strength and healing to this occasion. To our distinguished speakers and scholars, thank you for your powerful words and wisdom. You have reminded us not only of the wounds of the past, but of the resilience of the human spirit and the Sikh ethos of Jadikala, eternal optimism even in the face of adversity. To our Sikh Sangat and friends, as we move forward from today, let us carry with us this spirit of unity, of love and community justice. Together, we have the power to inspire change and ensure that the memory of 1984 serves as a force for good in the world. In closing, I'll leave you with the words of a survivor of the 1984 genocide. We may be bruised, but we are not broken. We may be scarred, but our spirit remains unshaken. Justice will prevail, for truth is eternal. Very eloquent and very nice words, Sanjhe. That brings to a conclusion our official proceedings for today. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for their words, their solidarity and their unity on what is a solemn commemorative occasion for the Australian and global Sikh community. I want to thank this Parliament for allowing us the opportunity to express our voice within its great hall. Ultimately, as a community, Australian Sikhs stand for human rights, for the freedom of expression and equality, which are the very principles on which this building is built. On this, the 40th anniversary of the remembrance of the events of November 1984, we remember those innocent lives lost and continue to strive to share the stories of the voiceless. To my school colleague from 20 years ago, who asked me those questions at the beginning of this day, I don't think he would have fathomed that his words would make it to Parliament one day. In a way, I'm pleased that he asked those questions, because it helps me to turn anger into education, turn emotion into advocacy, and to develop a voice to push back against ignorance and hate. Thank you all once more for attending, and once again, if we could join in sharing our faith. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. As a final note, I've also been asked just to mention that if anybody is interested in this particular book, it is a book called Sirf Dilli Nahi, and is written by Gurjant Singh Bal, who has travelled up and down India into each of the individual cities where any of the atrocities of 84 happened, and made a written record of everything that happened in those cities. If anybody is interested in this book, please contact Rumi Bhaji after this session is over. Thank you. And I think before we go today, there is an arrangement for them to go to the back of the hall there, so if we could all start to make our way over. And thank you once more for coming.
भाई मेरी फोटो लो चीज में
They're not going to lead to that. I need to talk to you. Sure, excellent.
all the best.
ਜਸਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਰਾਜਪੁਰਾ
ਰਾਜਪੁਰਾ
ਹਾਂਜੀ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ
ਉੱਥੇ ਕੋ ਟੀਵੀ ਚਲਾਉਂਦਾ ਆ ਮਨਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ
ਹਾਂਜੀ ਹਾਂਜੀ ਮਨਜੀਤ ਰਾਜਪੁਰਾ ਜੀ
Anyone that doesn't want to support the agenda, we don't support. So it's always going to be, yeah. Reach out. It's more like people that are definitely have thank you very much. I'll let you know.
हैरी में लाइव सीगा